Councilor McLean, followed by the Pledge of Allegiance.
Let's bow our heads for a moment of silence. Heavenly Father, bless and watch over us as we do the work of our city. Please allow us to make the right decisions that will make our community prosper. Let every council person and administration keep an open mind to change, as change can bring prosperity. I also pray for our freedom that every soldier has fought for. I pray for all those who have served in our armed forces and for the ones that have died for what they believe in. Lord, keep them safe. Amen.
Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Gordon?
Here.
Mr. McLean?
Here.
Mr. Lowe?
Here.
Mr. Tebben? Miss Adams?
Here.
Mr. Glenn? Mrs. Miles?
Here.
And Mr. Nixon.
Here. Are there any amendments to tonight's agenda?
Mr. President,
Mr. McLean?
we would like to add Edward Shine to the privilege of the floor.
Second.
The motion and the second is to add Edward Shine to privilege of the floor. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? The motion carries. Resolution 1214.
Mr. President,
Memorializing the late Thomas M. Francis, outstanding Lima citizen, and extending condolences to his family on behalf of the Lima City Council.
Mr. President,
Mr. McLean.
I move that Resolution 1214 be passed adopted on its first reading after being read.
Second.
The motion and the second is to adopt Resolution 1214 on its first reading after having been read. Is there any discussion? We'll have the clerk read the resolution, and then I'll open the floor for discussion.
Whereas, on March the 10th, 2014, the entire Lima community was saddened by the death of the voice of Lima land, Thomas M. Francis, whose many contributions have and will continue to affect the Lima land community. And whereas, Tom received a degree in radio speech from the Ohio University in 1956, he went on to serve his country in the Army, and that is where his career in journalism began, interviewing servicemen throughout France. After completing his tour of duty, he accepted a job with WIMA Radio in 1959, and that is where he stayed as the voice of Lima for 51 years until his retirement in 2010. And whereas Tom was committed to his community and served on many local organizations, he was a member and past president of the Lima Noon Optimist, where he was recognized as Optimist of the Year in 1990. While a member of Lima JCs, he was given the Distinguished Service Award in 1971. He served 33 years on the board of directors to the Lima YMCA and was inducted into the Lima Family YMCA Heritages Club Triangle of Honor in 2007. He served on many boards and committees of Trinity United Methodist Church. And whereas Tom lived out his love of baseball when he became a co-founder of the Lima Locos baseball team in 1988, which he owned until 2004. He was an avid fan of the Ohio State Buckeyes and was a member of the Ohio State University Alumni Association and the Advocates Board. He received the Alumni Citizenship Award in 2004, and the Ohio State University at Lima presented him the Violet Meeks Town and Gown Award also in 2004. And whereas Tom Francis loved Lima and was a big promoter of the community, Lima will always remember that wonderful voice of radio, and he will be greatly missed by the entire Lima community. Now therefore be it resolved that the Council of Lima, Ohio, that the Council of the City of Lima hereby acknowledges the many contributions of Thomas M. Francis, which have and will continue to benefit our citizens, and that the Council, on behalf of the entire community, expresses its condolences to his wife, Jean, his family members, and friends.
Is there any discussion? I would like to say to Jean and to other family members that are here, number one, thank you for sharing Tom with all of us here in Lima, okay? All of these things that are mentioned that he participated in take time, and your generosity with sharing him with us, we've all benefited. It seems like I've known him all of my life, from listening in the morning to school cancellations to find out if I had to go to school or not, to giving me a hand up in high school. He was a friend of my high school band director, Harry Folk, and I, at that time, had a desire to pursue a career in broadcasting. And he took time to talk with me about what type of college, what kind of training I would need, and later helped me get a job at WIMA running commercials in the studio during high school football games and basketball games. And I remember not only his radio personality, but his community leadership. And I remember him saying often that he visited Lima for a job and ended up staying for a lifetime. Lima is a better place because of Tom Francis. So I will then ask for the clerk to call the roll.
Mr. McLean,
Yes.
Mr. Lowe,
Yes.
Mr. Tebben, Miss Adams.
Yes.
Mr. Glenn, Mrs. Miles.
Yes.
Mr. Nixon.
Yes.
And Mr. Gordon.
Yes.
Resolution 1214 has been adopted on its first reading by a 6-0 vote. Gene, if you want to come forward, I'll hand you the resolution, and you can say a few words if you'd like.
When we came to Lima in 1959, we came for an interview, and we had to look on the map where Lima was, because we had never been in this part of the state. And he was hired right the next day, and he came to work, and then 1962 was when he took over the morning show. And considering when we came, he was going to be here 2 years because he thought he wanted a big city. And he grew to love Lima, and he loved the size of Lima, he loved the people in Lima. He worked for Lima, he was involved in a lot of things, and so I know he'd be proud of this. So, because he didn't do anything for any appreciation, he just did it because he loved it, and he loved what he did. And that he was just here at the right time, at the right place, and he was in the right situation. So thank you so much.
Thank you. There are no scheduled public hearings. Privilege of the floor, Mr. Edward Shine. Mr. Shine, if you'd come forward and state your name and address for the record, and our rules allow 3 minutes.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen of City Council. My name is Ed Shine. I live at 608 Prospect, and I'm just here to ask, is there anything can be done about these kids and these dumb grown folks walking in the street? I had an incident today on Harrison. 3 or 4 young girls walking in the street, and cars were coming this way. Took me about an extra 3 minutes to get home. I just want to know if there's anything that can be done about it. I know we tight, police is down, but it's very annoying to me that I'm going somewhere and I have to be held up because little kids, 15, 16-year-old, won't get over. And they call me a bunch of good names. So,
Everything but Mr. Shine, I'm sure.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
So that's the only gripe I have as far as, because the people that was in front of me, they had 2 babies in a stroller. And I couldn't go around them because I was approaching Kibbe on Harrison. And I couldn't go around. I just had to sit there. They looked at me like I was wrong. And there was sidewalk that they could walk on. If anything can be done, and I appreciate y'all's time.
Thank you. The consent calendar,
Mr. President,
Mrs. Miles.
I move that item number A on the consent calendar be received, filed, and approved, and items B, C, D, and E be received and filed.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive, file, and approve item A, and to receive and file items B, C, D, and E on the consent calendar. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 1.
From the Director of Community Development regarding legislation to place tax assessments for property maintenance.
Mr. President,
Ms. Adams.
I move that communication number 1 be received and filed. Legislation is on tonight's agenda.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number 1. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 2.
From the Director of Community Development regarding legislation to place tax assessments for demolition.
Mr. President,
Ms. Adams.
I move that communication number 2 be received, filed. Legislation also is on tonight's agenda.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number 2. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 3.
From the Deputy Director of Utilities requesting legislation to enter into an agreement with System Innovators, Inc.
Mr. President,
Mr. McLean.
I move that communication number 3 be received and filed and authorize the law director to prepare any necessary legislation.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number 3 and to authorize the law director to prepare any necessary legislation. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 4.
From the Deputy Director of Utilities requesting legislation to enter into an agreement with S&ME Engineering.
Mr. President,
Mr. McLean.
I move that communication number 4 be received and filed and authorize the law director to prepare any necessary legislation.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number 4 and to authorize the law director to prepare the necessary legislation. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 5.
From the Deputy Director of Utilities requesting legislation to advertise and contract for reactivation of granular activated carbon at the waste water treatment plant, at the water treatment, not waste.
At the water treatment.
Mr.
No
President,
waste.
Mr. McLean.
I move that communication number 5 be received and filed and authorize the law director to be prepare the necessary legislation.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass receive and file communication number 5 and to authorize the law director to prepare any necessary legislation. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 6.
From the Director of Utilities requesting legislation to enter into a contract with URS Consultants.
Mr. President,
Mr. McLean.
I move that communication number 6 be received and filed and authorize the law director to prepare any necessary legislation.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number 6 and to authorize the law director to prepare any necessary legislation. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 7.
From Chief Martin regarding legislation to enter into a memorandum of understanding with Allen County to accept a grant for the West Central Ohio Crime Task Force.
Mr. President,
Mr. Gordon.
I move that communication number 7 be received and filed.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number 7. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 8.
From Chief Hefner regarding approval of ambulance requirements waiver.
Mr. President,
Mr. Gordon.
I move that communication number 8 be received and filed and approved.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive, file, and approve communication number 8. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 9.
From the Ohio Division of Liquor Control regarding a transfer to Joey's on the Go drive-through.
Mr. President,
Ms. Adams.
I move that communication number 9 be received and filed, and that the clerk be authorized to file with no objections with the Ohio Division of Liquor Control.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number 9 and to authorize the clerk to notify the Ohio Division of Liquor Control of no objection. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 10.
From the Law Director regarding legislation regarding the Albert E. Gale Trust.
Mr. President,
Mrs. Miles.
I move that communication number 10 be received, filed, and approved.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number 10. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 11. From the Law Director regarding legislation regarding the Albert E. Gale Trust.
Mr. President,
Mrs. Miles.
I move that communication number 10 be received, filed, and approved.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive, receive and file communication number 10. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 11.
From the Law Director regarding legislation to clarify sick leave for employees who retired and rehired.
Mr. President,
Mr. Lowe?
I move that communication number 11 be received and filed. Legislation is on tonight's agenda.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number 11. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 12.
From the Law Director regarding legislation to enter into a lease with Citizens Building Corporation.
Mr. President,
Mr. Lowe?
I move that communication number 12 be received and filed. Legislation is on tonight's agenda.
Need a second.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number 12. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 13.
From the Director of Public Works regarding legislation to enter into a lease with Valico LLC.
Mr. President,
Ms. Adams?
I move that communication number 13 be received and filed. Legislation is on tonight's agenda.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number 13. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Petitions.
A rezoning at 720 South Cable Road initiated by the City of Lima.
Mr. President,
Mrs. Miles.
I move that this petition be received and filed, and that the law director prepare the necessary legislation, that the clerk cause publication of the legal ad and notify abutting property owners of the public hearing to be held on July 21st, 2014 at 7 p.m.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file the petition, and as stated by Councilor Miles. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Next, we have reports of officials. Connie Dersham, the Neighborhood Support Services.
Small.
Yeah, you can't leave one there.
You can just leave them with me and I'll put them in their mailboxes. One for Tom, one for Darren. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, I promise I'll make this brief, even though you have a whole book. I just wanted to take an opportunity to kind of give you guys an overview of the Neighborhood Support Program and some of the things that have been happening, things that are going on in the neighborhoods. You'll see on the first page, the very first thing is kind of a short overview of the Neighborhood Support Program. Those are the services that are provided from my office. And what that means is that I help the neighborhoods with resources and networking and building partnerships with other organizations in the community. When you go back through this packet and you look at all the things that are going on, I don't do all those things. I just help the neighborhoods figure out how to do them. And there really is an astronomical amount of things that go on throughout the year. I'll just show you some of this stuff. Excuse me. The second page in your packet is the activities for the first 6 months of the year. That's the CDBG year. One of the important things that I wanted you to know is the next piece in your packet. This is something that we give the neighborhoods It's our expectation of what the neighborhoods are going to do and what they're going to provide back to the city. Now, we have, starting this year, fill this out twice a year. In March at the first half of the year and in September at the end of the year. So this helps us gather all the information about individual neighborhoods, what they're doing, maybe what they're not doing, and gives us an idea of what kinds of things we can help them with and what direction we need to focus with the neighborhood. So this piece of paper is an important one. A couple other things briefly. You will see last year we received a litter prevention collection and awareness grant from the Ohio EPA. One of the things that we're doing is bringing back the Plant Pride Not Litter yard signs. So there's an actual nomination form in your packet. So if you know people that have well-kept properties and you think they would, enjoy having a Plant Pride Not Litter sign, it's a pretty easy application. One of the other things that is coming out of that litter prevention grant is the Community Pride Cleanup Supply Trailer. And it's a trailer that's all decorated up and full of tools. This is the actual application. It'll give you all the details about it. Other groups in the community can borrow that trailer to do cleanups in various areas. So that's an exciting thing that we're just now rolling out this year. It's been used once so far, so that's good. Then there's just some flyers in there about upcoming events. Also, I included the packet for the Care Academy for this year. I think probably most of you know what the Care Academy is. If you don't, it's all explained in this packet. And I would encourage you to, when you're talking to citizens, encourage them to come and attend the Care Academy. We can only take 20 people in each class, but it's really worth it. It's a great experience. Regional Neighborhood Network Conference is coming up. Lima is one of the member cities of the conference. That is 5 states: Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Kentucky, and Tennessee. And the conference travels each year to a different city. Lima hosted in 2008. I would kind of like to do that again soon, maybe in a few years. But it's a great way for our residents and neighborhood people to learn what other people in other states are doing. And then they can bring those programs back here. The Block Watch, the tool shed, the community gardens, all those kind of things our neighbors have learned about from other conferences. So it's an important thing that we do. And the last page in your packet is results of this year's citywide pride cleanups. And that's just a FYI for you. Questions from anybody?
Mr. President.
What's that?
Thank you. Ms. Dersham, I've had 2 neighborhood meetings I've already shared the Care Academy information with.
Great.
And as more have gone through it, they see how meaningful it is, how educational, and don't think you'll have any problems with the 2 neighborhood associations that I have contact with.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I was
they're-
trying to think in my head today, and I wasn't in the office. I couldn't go back and add it up. But I think there should be somewhere just over 70 people that have graduated from the Care Academy. This will be the 6th year, so,
Yeah, it's a wonderful
yeah.
series and very informative. Also, I saw the ad in the paper with the results of the citywide pride. I happened to participate at Hope and Midway East, the 2 weekends that they each had one, and had them lined up on the street. It was well received, well used. I think all neighborhood associations were busy.
Yeah.
I know we had 3 dumpsters at each location that we filled, so I think we turned away at least Midway East. I think we had 35 loads, and we had at least 35 with tires that we sent to College Street that
Right,
day.
I saw that, yeah.
Yeah, so, we had a lot of tires.
Yeah, it really is amazing, the amount of
Yeah.
things that are collected each year. Today, I had a message, a phone call from somebody. Well, they took advantage of it last year, and they wanted to know, was it coming up this year? It's like, oops, you just missed it.
Yeah. No, it's a great series that you run in the spring on this. I know the
Thank you.
neighbors appreciate it in the neighborhoods, and makes things start out right for the season, so, thank you.
All right,
Thank you, Mr. President.
Is there any other comments, discussion?
okay,
Thank
thank
you.
you all. Anytime you'd like more information, feel free to call me or stop up or, thank you.
Will do. Thanks, Tom. Reports of committees, safety services.
Mr. President,
Mr. Gordon.
the Safety Services Committee met on March 3rd and March 17th and June 2nd to discuss the vicious dog ordinance, and also in the first meeting to discuss the ambulance licensing. And all the counselors received a copy of the minutes from all 3 meetings, and I would like to ask for the minutes to be received, filed, and to correct the date on the 3rd page to June 2nd of 2014 due to error.
Second.
The motion, the second, is to receive and file and approve the Safety Services Committee meeting notes and report. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Resolution 1314.
A resolution in support of receiving funds from the Albert E. Gale Park Fund Trust.
Mr. President,
Mrs. Miles?
I move that resolution number 1314 be adopted on its first reading.
Second?
The motion, the second, is to adopt Resolution 1314 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tebben? Ms. Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn? Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
And Mr. Gordon.
Yes.
Resolution 1314 has been passed on its first reading by a 6-0 vote. Ordinance 13414.
Amending Chapter 618 of the Codified Ordinances of Lima, Ohio.
Mr. President,
Mr. Gordon.
I move that ordinance 13413 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion, the second, is to pass ordinance 13414 on its first reading. Is there any discussion?
Mr. President,
Mr. McLean.
I would like to thank Mr. Geiger for his hard work on this. I know that he spent sleepless nights trying to figure out what was legal and what was not to do on this, and I appreciate the help that he put forth. And I think he gave us a tool that we can use, especially to the police department and to our community. And I want to thank him for that, and the committee member chairman that worked so diligently with him. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McLean. Is there any further discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. McLean?
Yes?
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tebben? Ms. Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn? Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
And Mr. Gordon.
Yes.
Ordinance 13414 has been passed on its first reading by a 6-0 vote. Ordinance 13514.
Amending Ordinance 7014.
Mr.
Sorry.
Mr. President,
Mrs. Miles.
I move that ordinance number 3514 be passed on its first reading.
Second?
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 13514 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tebben? Ms. Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn? Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
And Mr. Gordon.
Yes.
Ordinance 13514 has been passed on its first reading by a 6-0 vote. Ordinance 13614.
Authorizing the mayor to enter into a contract for the purchase of computers for the Utilities Department.
Mr. President,
Mr. McLean.
I move that ordinance 13614 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 13614 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? Will the clerk call the roll?
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin? Ms. Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn? Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
And Mr. Gordon.
Yes.
Ordinance 13614 has been passed on its first reading by a 6-0 vote. Ordinance 13714.
Levying a special assessment for demolition charges for dangerous structures in the city of Lima, Ohio.
Mr. President,
Ms. Adams.
I move that ordinance 137-14 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 13714 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin? Ms. Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn? Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
And Mr. Gordon.
Yes.
Ordinance 13714 has been passed on its first reading by a 6-0 vote. Ordinance 13814.
Levying special assessments for property maintenance code charges on premises in the city of Lima, Ohio.
Mr. President,
Ms. Adams.
I move that ordinance 138-14 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 13814 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin? Ms. Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn? Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
And Mr. Gordon.
Yes.
Ordinance 13814 has been passed on its first reading by a 6-0 vote. Ordinance 13914.
Authorizing the mayor to enter into a lease agreement with Citizens Building Corporation for the rental of space for the city law department.
Mr. President,
Mr. Lowe.
I move that 13914 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 13914 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin? Ms. Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn? Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
And Mr. Gordon.
Yes.
Ordinance 13914 has been passed on its first reading by a 6-0 vote. Ordinance 14014.
Authorizing the mayor to enter into an agreement with the Allen County Board of Commissioners.
Mr. President,
Mr. Gordon.
I move that ordinance 140-14 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 14014 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin? Ms. Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn? Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
And Mr. Gordon.
Yes.
Ordinance 14014 has been passed on its first reading by a 6-0 vote. Ordinance 14114.
Authorizing the mayor to enter into a lease agreement with Valico LLC.
Mr. President,
Ms. Adams.
I move that ordinance number 141-14 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 14114 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin? Ms. Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn? Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
And Mr. Gordon.
Yes.
Ordinance 14114 has been passed on its first reading by a 6-0 vote. Ordinance 14214.
Amending Section 244.02 of the Codified Ordinances of Lima, Ohio.
Mr. President,
Mr. Lowe.
I move that ordinance 14214 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 14214 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin? Ms. Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn? Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
And Mr. Gordon.
Yes.
Ordinance 14214 has been passed on its first reading by a 6-0 vote. Ordinance 14314.
Amending Section 244.03 of the Codified Ordinances of Lima, Ohio. And
Mr. President, sorry.
Mrs. Miles.
I move that ordinance 143-14 be received on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 14314 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin? Ms. Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn? Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
And Mr. Gordon.
Yes.
Ordinance 143-14 has been passed on its first reading by a 6-0 vote. Ordinance 144-14.
Providing for the issuance and sale of bonds in an aggregate principal amount of $36,150 to pay in anticipation of the collection of special assessments heretofore levied, the cost of constructing sidewalks at various locations in the city, together with all necessary appurtenances thereto.
Mr. President,
Ms. Adams?
I move that ordinance 144 dash,
You need to do the
Fiscal officers first.
okay,
That goes first.
receive, file, and approve the fiscal officer's certificate.
Second.
Second.
Motion and the second is to receive, file, and approve the fiscal officer's certificate. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of that motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? The motion carries.
Mr. President,
Ms. Adams?
I move that ordinance 144-14 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 144-14 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tebben? Ms. Adams?
Yes,
Mr. Glenn? Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
And Mr. Gordon.
Yes.
Ordinance 144-14 has been passed on its first reading by a 6-0 vote. Miscellaneous business, Mr. McLean.
I have a couple items today. One, I had the invocation tonight, and one of the things that I talked about was last Friday was D-Day. There was a lot of people fought for our freedom. We lost a lot of good soldiers over there. There's still very few living. But there's been many soldiers since that time that fought for our freedom, and I personally wanted to thank them and to let them know that that's very valuable to me. And also that we have a very important day coming up on Sunday, which is Father's Day. I've got a few kids myself, and I really enjoy that day. I get to be with them, and they kind of get to feed me and pamper me a little bit. So Father's Day's coming up on Sunday. If your father's still alive, please enjoy him while you can. Congratulations to the Bath girls softball team and the LCC track team. We're getting a lot of state championships in our little city, and I tell you, it's nice to see, and I want to let them know that we're back here rooting for them, and we appreciate that. And the Northside Neighborhood Association meeting will be held on Tuesday, well, let me look at the right calendar, June the 17th. That will be at St. Gerard's Parish Hall, or actually the cafeteria at 7 p.m. Everybody's welcome to come out, enjoy themselves with us, and have a little communication about the north side of Lima. And lastly, I would like a resolution honoring a lost city councilman that passed away and was buried today, Jim Lyles. I'd like to make a motion to memorialize him.
Second.
The motion and the second is to authorize a resolution memorializing Jim Lyles. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. Lowe?
Thank you, Mr. President. One thing, I made a slight pause on ordinance 135-14. I know the vote isn't going to make a difference at this point, but I would like it to go into minutes that I made a mistake. I did plan on voting no, and it was just a jumble in the papers. We got a lot of papers up here, and that's why I hesitated, but my vote was to be a no, if the secretary would note that. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Lowe. Ms. Adams?
thank you, Mr. President. Couple things this evening. First, I'd like to, if I could, Mr. President, ask Chief Martin if he could come up and address the issue that was brought to us under privilege of the floor, walking in the streets, that this was noted in the location and the action the police normally take or will take.
Mr. President,
Chief?
yes, it was noted as to Mr. Shine's address, and I am going to be passing that information on so that officers, as they're working in that area, will know to pay a little bit stricter attention to walking the street. And that is something that we do get complaints on all around the community. And I will tell you that one of the things Mr. Shine commented on was that it's not just kids, there are adults also. And so that is the type of thing that people get very upset about when we issue them citations for walking in the street. But if there are sidewalks provided, that is in fact illegal. And it is something that we do take enforcement action on.
If I could, Mr. President. Chief, I made a couple calls in the last week or so on curfew around Freedom Elementary School. And I talked to Major Baker, who said that they were waiting on school to adjourn for the summer, and that this would move up on enforcing the curfew and especially around the schools. I mean, we want the children to enjoy the playground areas and that, but, you know, at 10 o'clock at night, when you see an 8-year-old out there with no adult supervision, you get a little concerned. And it's not that they're up to any good, or no, you know, it's not that, it's the safety of the child too, and getting home at that hour. But I wanted to get a concurrence from you that that is the case, that is, the curfew is rising in the level of the patrolmen's at night.
Well, actually, you're giving me a chance to rehearse a little bit of what I was going to say tomorrow night at the city focus meeting regarding curfew. Actually, yes, that is something that each year about this time we start seeing as the weather breaks and we have kids getting out of school and they're able to stay out later. We start seeing an uptick in the amount of juvenile offenses or juveniles involved in crime. We also start seeing an uptick in the juveniles that are being victimized as a result of crime. As my mother used to always say, nothing good happens after 10 o'clock. At the time when I was under 18, I didn't necessarily believe her, but since then I've come to find out she was right. But so yes, we are, and actually we have been seeing an increase in curfew arrest already, but also with some money that council approved for us actually some time back from the 331 account or the Law Enforcement Trust Fund is money that we're going to be utilizing for curfew operations to be able to specifically target in the areas where we're seeing more of the juvenile activity to target those curfew violations. And one of the nice things about targeting the curfew is that is a low-level offense. That's not something that's going to likely keep a young person out of the military, keep a young person out of college, or eliminate them from other jobs such as if they should later on decide to become a police officer, whereas a more serious offense very well could be, or again, if we had a tragic situation where that child was seriously injured or even killed. For any parents that want to know what the curfew times are, that is on the city's website, cityhall.lima.oh.us. And also, there's a link to that if you go into the police department, under departments with the drop-down menu to police department, and there'll be another drop-down menu where that link is at, so that there's no questions. And I guess the other thing that I'd like to point out in this forum is that the parents can also be held accountable and, in fact, will be charged if we can establish that they were knowingly permitting their child to be out after curfew.
Thank you, Chief.
Thank you.
Mr. President, since Councilor Tibbin isn't here, I thought he would want to announce the Mayor Focus tomorrow night at 6 p.m. at Lacknip Resource Center on Spring Street, sponsored by Lakewood West Neighborhood Association. And since Councilor and Chairman Derry Glenn of the Community Development Committee, Economic Development Committee is not here, I wanted to put a reminder out that June the 11th, the first public hearing will be at 5:30 in these chambers, where Councilor Glenn and the committee will receive the proposed allocations for the fifth year of the CDBG Home 2014-2015 program year dollars and programs that'll be funded. So that is this coming Wednesday, June the 11th at 5:30 in these chambers. I'd like to thank the Traffic Commission for hearing a concern that I had referred to them on Dewey Avenue. I attended the meeting. I appreciate their decision. The residents also appreciate the decision and recommendation by the city engineer. And Midway East Neighborhood Association will be meeting on June 19th, Thursday at 7 p.m. at 727 Kibbe Street. And finally, I'd like to make a motion to prepare a resolution memorializing a citizen of Lima, Henrietta Spencer.
Second.
The motion and the second is to authorize a resolution memorializing Henrietta Spencer. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? The motion carries.
That's all. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you,
President.
Ms. Adams. Mrs. Miles.
Mr. President, just a couple of things here. Westgate Neighborhood Association is meeting Sunday, June 15, which is Father's Day. Happy Father's Day to all our dads. It will be 6:30 p.m. at Chamberlain Huckabee Funeral Home, and the speaker will be Mr. Brian McKinney from the Sheriff's Department. All are welcome to attend the Westgate Neighborhood Association meeting. And lastly, I would like to just do a personal tribute to Maya Angelou, who passed away last week here. She was someone that was very instrumental in my coming up as a teenager. I used to read all of her poetry. She was a woman of spoken words. She stood for peace, empowerment, and tolerance. And for anyone who would like to read a very powerful poem for their daughters, for their women in their life, it's called Phenomenal Woman. And this is a great reading, and it really was an inspiration to me. It helped me to get to where I am today because the encouragement and the inspiration of her words. So Maya Angelou, a woman that did a lot for the world, for the community, spoke at a lot of the president's meetings and so forth. But I just want to do a tribute to her. She came here several years ago and spoke in Lima. And again, a woman that truly made a difference in my life. And I really will miss her, but her poetry and what she stood for will continue on as she has passed away. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Miles. Mr. Gordon?
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, I want to make sure I'm doing this right. I want to move that Councilor Glenn and Councilor Tevin be excused. Do I need to do that?
I just need to check. Do we have to do two separate motions?
I think it's okay to do it.
Okay. Actually, I had it on my list. The motion is to move that the absence and salary of Councilors Tevin and Councilor Glenn be approved.
Yeah, what he said.
Second.
So the motion, the second, is to approve the absence and salary of Councilors Tevin and Glenn. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries.
Okay. About a week or so, I had a fire in my neighborhood, and it was about maybe between midnight and 1 a.m. that I believe it began because I was well asleep and woke up. But I got to go outside and watch the guys, the police and the firefighters at work. And I thought it was important to say something when somebody does something good because these guys were so professional. And you know, not that it matters, but they didn't know who I was watching. I was in my pajamas out there watching these guys. I probably scared me. But, you know, I just think it needs to be mentioned that what a great job these guys did. You know, I was really proud actually even to be the chair of the Safety Services Committee and work with these guys. So, you know, I mentioned to both chiefs, I made a call to let them know, but I just kind of wanted to do it publicly. Also, the code enforcement, I've been keeping them busy. I'm sure everybody has been, but I've been getting a lot of calls, and man, everything that I've called about, they've been getting out there on it. So I wanted to thank people in code enforcement. And I also made a call to Mr. Caprella, who we had a nice picture to look at today, and he had some very quick action, and so I wanted to thank Mike. And then last of all, I want to ask people to ask everyone in the community to be respectful of each other's differences and be open to understanding. And finally, as I always do, I want to remind everyone to be good to each other. And that's all I have.
Thank you, Mr. Gordon. Everybody took everything I had, so. I do have one thing, though, and that is that we need to have an executive session. So I'm going to move that we adjourn into executive session for the purposes of discussing real estate.
Second.
Thank you. Man, I was hanging out there.
We're slow.
So the motion on the second is to adjourn into executive session. I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tebben? Miss Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn? Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes?
And Mr. Gordon.
That's 6.
Yes.
We will adjourn into executive session in 5 minutes.